One of the approaches that we use at Justice Innovation Lab is systems thinking. We take a human-centered design approach to problem solving. That first step is often understanding the problem and defining the problem. The second step is ideating on solutions and developing prototype solutions. And then finally, the third step, building those solutions and testing them to see whether or not they're working as intended. But key to moving forward with our approach is developing a better understanding of what is happening in the jurisdiction today. And one of the greatest tools at our disposal is systems thinking. So first, what is a system? A system is an interconnected set of elements designed to achieve a purpose. As you can tell by that broad definition, it applies to virtually anything. It applies to our teams, it applies to our schools, it applies to our organizations and businesses, it applies to our own families. And a key step in using systems thinking effectively is first understanding what the purpose is. What is the purpose of the American criminal justice system? What should be the purpose of the American criminal justice system? If you ask people around the country, they'll tell you it's designed to achieve accountability. It's designed to achieve public safety. But if you look at how our system operates in reality, oftentimes it's functioning in ways that makes our communities less safe and fails to bring accountability. And most importantly, it fails to address many of the root causes that lead to crime in the first place. I love systems thinking because it gives us a new vocabulary for talking about the problems that we face. A lot of times in America, you will hear people talk about systemic problems or systemic racism. And so why not turn to the field to address systemic problems? And it's important to recognize that a system is not the sum of its parts, but it's the products of our interactions. And another saying that we have in systems thinking is that systems are perfectly designed to achieve the results that they are currently receiving. So if we don't like the results that we're receiving, systems thinking tells us that we need to change the system itself. And so if a system is the product of its interactions, a key part of systems thinking is to understand the relationships and the interactions between component parts of a system so that we can achieve the outcomes that we desire. The first step in using systems thinking is to define the system's purpose, values, goals, and objectives. If we're going to use systems thinking to effectively move a system forward, it helps by coming up with a common understanding of what is our objective. If the purpose of our system is to achieve public safety, perhaps we should focus on the root causes of many of those crimes by addressing mental health, substance abuse, and issues that stem from poverty. Systems thinking enables people to see how their own actions and the role that their organizations play contribute to negative outcomes in their community. So the first concept we're going to talk about today in systems thinking are leverage points. Leverage points are areas where a small change or effort can have an outsized impact on the outcome. Some of the areas to look for are process. Understanding a process and understanding key components of that process that have a disproportionate impact on the outcome. Another leverage point is on the tools and infrastructure being used. Are the tools that we're currently using to solve a problem insufficient? And are there better tools that would help us move through the process more efficiently and more effectively? One area to look at is structure. Who is the decision maker and how is that decision made? Are there ways that we can improve the process to make stronger decisions? A great leverage point inside systems comes by finding the appropriate skill set to solve the problem. Every one of us brings different skill sets, mindsets, connections to a problem. And oftentimes, a key decider lacks the expertise to make a particular decision. A leverage point can shift that decision making to a person with the appropriate skill set. One key idea that's helpful in solving problems is the 80-20 principle, which says basically that a small number of inputs have a disproportionate effect on outputs. And so our goal as systems thinker is to find those leverage points that it can have a disproportionately positive impact on outcomes. One leverage point is setting a common strategy. As mentioned before, when people working for a change share a common purpose, it makes it easier to find areas of the system that can be improved upon. One of the key problems inside systems are the things that slow us down and bring inefficiencies. When we're deconstructing a system and mapping out how a process moves from point A to point B, we often find there are components that are leading to unnecessary delays. Fixing a bottleneck often helps improve the outcome. In justice systems, bottlenecks almost always lead to injustice. And so if our goal is to reduce the amount of injustice in our system, a great starting place is on a bottleneck. As you're mapping out your system, try to identify places where you're seeing unnecessary bottlenecks and delays in your process, and begin thinking, how do we improve that? Default positions. What is a default position? A default position is our set response that happens most of the time. A great example of where we can see default systems in the criminal legal system is in the assignment of defense counsel. In some jurisdictions, when you are arrested, it is assumed that you will get a public defender. You get appointed counsel at the time of your arrest, and should you be able to afford your own attorney, you then no longer get access to public counsel. But in many jurisdictions we've worked in, the assumption is that you can afford an attorney, and so you are not assigned a public defender at the beginning. The vast majority of people entering criminal justice systems across America are indigent and operating at the lower quadrant of socioeconomics in America. What does that mean for system process? It means that oftentimes arrestees will go weeks or even months without having assigned counsel, causing unnecessary delays and oftentimes likely unnecessary incarceration. Changing the default position makes it more likely that you can address a problem. And so in jurisdictions where the assumption is that you get public counsel, those cases typically move far faster because representation is a key component in our justice system. Feedback loops. How systems run themselves. In every system, component parts that are interacting give each other feedback. A classic example from systems thinking is the thermostat. Now in my home, I like to set the thermostat to a comfortable 70 degrees. When the temperature hits your ideal temperature, the system stops running. When it drops to a certain amount, it's time to heat up again. And that system will continuously give itself feedback loops. If it's too hot, the system will tell itself to cool down. If it's too cold, the system will tell itself to heat up. But the system is communicating with itself so that we keep the baseline desired goal of 70 degrees. That's an example of a balancing feedback loop, where the system is telling itself to balance at a certain set temperature point. But feedback loops can also be positive feedback loops or negative feedback loops. Our goal is to make feedback loops positive, also known as virtual cycles, where different components are giving each other feedbacks so that the results continuously get better. In Charleston, South Carolina, we saw how screeners at the intake process were using feedback as a way to get better outcomes. Now, typically in a case, when the police make an arrest, they don't often find out what happens with that case for many months or many years. Historically in Charleston, the police would make an arrest, it would get assigned to a deputy who would then assign it to a junior attorney. That process could take months. With the new process set up in Charleston, a screener is reviewing virtually every case within the first week of the arrest. What the screeners have begun doing is seeing problematic cases. Now, typically, if a case was problematic, a case might be dismissed, but the police officer who had made the problematic arrest would never even know why that case was dismissed. So as a part of the new process in Charleston, screeners are giving feedback directly to the police officers, why this case was legally insufficient. A lot of times, the facts won't meet the elements of the crime. Sometimes, a stop may be unconstitutional. But rather than waiting for that to play out over months or even years, prosecutors are giving police officers immediate feedback. And what we have seen is this new form of feedback, close in time to the underlying conduct, is having actual impacts on police behavior. Many police officers making arrests are new patrol officers. They often have inadequate supervision, and they often have inadequate training. What these new feedback loops are doing is changing police behavior so they're more in line with their obligations under the law and under the Constitution. On the other hand, we often see negative feedback loops within the justice system, and one of the most obvious places that we tend to see that is police use of force. In many interactions with civilians, language used by police officers at the start can lead to negative escalation that increases the likelihood that use of force will be used or that an arrest might be made. So as we're deconstructing a system, we should think about the different types of feedback that might take place in that system. How are the component parts communicating with each other such that they can function in a healthier, more functional way, contributing to the outcomes that are desired? Who is the decider? Now, one of the things that we will often do in deconstructing a decision is to understand who is the decision maker. As Marshall Goldsmith, the famed leadership coach, likes to say, the decider decides. Understanding the process with which a particular decider makes a decision can become key on improving that process to be able to make smarter, more effective, more accurate decisions. Incentives. Every decision maker or decision-making component has incentives towards making their decisions. And if the decider is making decisions in an ineffective way, one great way to change the outcomes is by changing the incentives. Figure out what the incentives of the decision maker are so that they can then be incentivized to make better decisions. One of the best ways to use systems thinking to improve your system is systems mapping. And today we're going to talk about two different types of systems mapping and how they can be used to make better decisions. The first is a process map, in which we break down a given process into its component parts to understand how those different parts interact, such that we can perhaps get better outcomes in a given process. The second is relationship mapping, and this is often key to understanding who needs to be a part of your conversations in order to fix a system. Process mapping, what is it? It's the different components of a process that lead to whatever outcome you're looking to address. I'll give you an example from my own life. Putting a child to bed. What is the process? At a given time, it becomes bedtime. What happens next? The child has to brush their teeth, has to put on their pajamas. What happens after they do that? They get to pick a book to read. What happens after that? We read the book, and then we try to put them to bed. But of course, that's how it's supposed to work. That's not how it works day to day. But using systems thinking, we can begin to map out where things go wrong. For us, everyone knew that at 8 o'clock, we were going to start the process. And if our goal was to have the kids asleep by 9, we knew we needed to start at 8 o'clock to keep that process going. Bedtime was set by the parents. So in this particular case, the decider was the parents. Now, once we tell the child that it's bedtime, the child becomes the decider. They can go along with the rules and the plan, or they can resist. This is often the first bottleneck in the bedtime process. If the child goes along with what we're saying, they then brush their teeth, they choose a book. But of course, choosing a book isn't always that easy. There's hundreds of books to choose from, and so that often becomes a bottleneck in the process, further delaying bedtime. Now, once we've got a book and we've read the book, it's time for the child to go to bed. Of course, the child may decide something different. The child may choose they want a snack. If we give the kid a snack, we then need to brush teeth again, which then leads them to wanting another book, which leads to a negative feedback loop, further delaying bedtime. Where do we see default positions? Could changing a default position perhaps lead to different outcomes? Do we want to keep the current decider deciding? Do we need to do things to support the decision-making process? We want to look at feedback loops. Where are those component parts, different deciders, interacting with each other? Is their feedback leading to positive outcomes such that the system gets better? Are they leading to negative outcomes such that we're getting further and further away from our objectives? What are the incentives in this system? And are there things that we can do to change the incentive structure, perhaps to get different outcomes? Where are the parts of the process that are unnecessarily slowing things down? That becomes a great leverage point for improving efficiencies in the system. Relationship maps, or network mapping, is a way to understand the relationships between different component parts of a system. If we're trying to improve processes, if we're trying to improve outcomes by changing the relationship between component parts of a system, we need to make sure that we're including the right people in our discussions about how to fix a system. So how does it work to build a network map? The first thing that you need to do is to define the limits of your system. What system are we talking about? Are we talking about a school system? Are we talking about our family? Are we talking about the criminal justice system? The second part is to pick a focal point. Whose interests are we trying to affect? In the criminal justice system, it could be the perspective of the prosecutor. It could be the perspective of the defense attorney. It could be the perspective of the court. It could be the perspective of the victim or perhaps the arrestee. But understanding the nature of those relationships will be key. The next part of doing a relationship map is to think of all of the possible people that interact in this system. In the criminal justice system, there's prosecutors, police, judges, defendants, victims, but there are a lot more people whose input are going to be vital, particularly if our idea is to address things like public safety by addressing public health, mental health, and substance abuse. Other actors that we should consider bringing in are health officials. Recognizing that many of our outcomes stem from early education, bringing in educators. So as you're brainstorming the nature of the relationships in the system, put as many people down that you can think of. This is brainstorming, and our goal is to be over-inclusive rather than under-inclusive. Once you've got all of the actors listed, begin to think about how the different actors interact with each other. In the criminal justice system, thinking about what is the relationship between the prosecutors and the defense attorneys? What's the relationship between the defense attorneys and the defendants themselves? What's the relationship between the judge and the victims? In each system, those relationships will be different. As I've traveled across the United States, I've seen offices where prosecutors and defense attorneys have strong relationships and work effectively in solving problems. And I have seen many systems in which the adversarial nature of those relationships continue to lead to bad outcomes for victims, for defendants, and for public safety as a whole. Understanding which are the key relationships in a system will be key not only to bringing those voices in, but recognizing where we need to spend our time in order to make the system more effective. Another step in using effective network mapping and relationship mapping is to then group and categorize those different actors in a way that helps us see commonalities. Are there certain groups that are more connected? Are there certain groups that are less connected? Once we have our groups of actors in a system and understand their connections, it's helpful to then break down those relationships and ask a few basic questions. How do these different component groups communicate? Do they do it in writing? Do they meet face-to-face? Understanding how component parts communicate are going to often offer leverage points and how you can improve relationships. Alignment. How are the different component parts of a system aligned? Do they agree on the objective? Do they have conflicting interests as to what the objectives should be? Understanding whether or not there is alignment between component parts will be helpful in finding solutions to a systemic problem. Power. Who has power in this particular system? Oftentimes we'll see power concentrated in a single individual or possibly multiple individuals. Who doesn't have power in this system? Recognizing the impact of systemic choices on the marginalized inside a system are going to be important because oftentimes marginalized communities don't even have a voice in the process. In the criminal justice system, that may be the defendant, that may be an arrestee, that may be the victims. Ensuring that we are including their voices in the conversations about how to improve systems is key to building a more effective, more holistic system. Influence. Even though a person may not have direct power over a decision, they may be able to influence a decision. In the criminal justice system, even though prosecutors don't have the ultimate power over what a sentence would be, that's left to the judge, we know that they have incredible influence shaping that, particularly by what charges they choose. Whether or not a case has a mandatory minimum can often be determinative of what an ultimate sentence is. Understanding the influence that different actors have on a decision and on other actors is going to be key in finding good leverage points to make a change. Value. Where are different relationships exchanging value? Value can be time, it can be money, it can be influence. Understanding the interactions that gain or lose value in a system will be a leverage point where you can make a difference. As you're connecting the different component parts on each of these different systems, draw a line. Draw a thick line if the relationship is strong, if there are strong communications, for example. Draw a thin line if there are weak communications. Maybe draw a dotted line if those communications are dysfunctional. And as you map this through for value exchanges, for communications, for influence, for power, it will immediately become apparent where the system is breaking down. Whether or not you're using a process map or a network map as a way to identify problems in a system, you should ask yourself a few questions after you've made that map. What does your map tell you about the current state of the system? Where are there areas that can be improved? What questions come up for you? A lot of times when building a systems map, it quickly becomes apparent that you don't actually understand how a different actor is making their choices. And so it becomes important to expand the people building that system, not only to include people who are like-minded or in a similar situation as you, but may not have their voice at the table. Where we've seen maps used incredibly effective, communities bring a diverse set of stakeholders to the table to build these maps. And when you do it collectively with a wide array of experiences, skill sets, perspectives, you can build a more holistic map of your community and begin to figure out where can we make the biggest difference today. I love systems thinking. I think systems thinking can help us solve these large, intractable problems that involve many different stakeholders. Oftentimes, these problems can feel overwhelming, but systems mapping, whether we're using a process map or a network map, will point us in the right direction where we can make the biggest difference right now. Where do we need new tools? Where do we need to strengthen relationships? How can we improve feedback loops? Are there bottlenecks that we can address today? Do we need to change incentive structures? These are going to be great avenues to moving your system so that it is more likely to achieve its purpose.